Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
My pleasure to be on.
We recently heard the news of a bow and arrow attack in Norway. An individual went in and killed 5 people and injured many others. This was a person who was a Muslim convert. So, Dr. Shabir, this brings to the fore again the age-old question, does Islam have any sort of relationship with terrorism and violence? Or is this just a freak attack? So maybe you can explain that, Dr. Shabir.
Yeah, we discussed this a lot for the 20 years ago after the 9/11 attacks, and then we became satisfied that we have explored it in great detail. We showed that there are many verses of the Quran and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that go against attacking civilians and killing people in such a wanton manner. And at the same time, we showed that there are some passages in the Quran, and more so in the Hadith, that might be misunderstood, misapplied, and taken as justification for this kind of terrorist attack by some wayward Muslim youth in particular, sometimes acting alone, sometimes acting as part of a concerted group who have some big dream of setting up an Islamic caliphate in some part of the world and so on. So while we have left the matter to rest, the Islamophobes have never given up. They continue to drum the same old claims that Islam is so inextricably linked with terrorism, that in order to be a good Muslim, you have to be this violent person who goes attacking non-Muslims, even civilians. And their claim seems to get some impetus when something like this happens. A Muslim, even a new Muslim, a convert to Islam, perhaps not so well steeped in the faith, to at least not having been given enough time to learn all of the rudiments of the faith and to absorb the ethos of the faith in general. And then this person, perhaps with some mental health issues prior to this, some previous convictions which may indicate, a certain inclination towards crime. And then this person does something, and then because of his Muslimness or his Muslim name, or in this case, he's got a Dutch name, but his connection with Islam somehow is going to fuel this discussion all over again, where the Islamophobes will come out and say, see, here's another example where the Muslims are doing this.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Shabir, how would you respond? I know it's unfortunate that you're asked this question again, but how would you respond if someone says, look, it's a Muslim all over again, it's an Islamic thing?
Well, first I would point out that it's not only Muslims. I don't mean to say that this is not bad. It is bad. It is bad for anyone to do it, and it is even worse for a Muslim to do it. Worse for a Muslim to do it because the Muslim has a religion which actually teaches us to respect life, to value other people, to be kind towards others, and so on. So the person who does this as a Muslim is violating Islamic principles. Moreover, they are marring the image of the religion in the sight of others. And third, they're endangering fellow Muslims because other people may increase their hate for Muslims as a result of such incidents, and then that hate will eventually translate into violence against Muslims. And we see it happening, like a Muslim being a whole Muslim family being hit recently in London, Ontario, not far from where we live, and struck to their death. So with only one survivor who was in critical condition in the hospital. And so this eventually will harm the religion. It will harm Muslims themselves, and of course, it reflects badly on the individual for having violated the principles of Islam. But when we look around the world, we see that the London example, where somebody attacks Muslims, is not the only kind of terrorist attack that is out there. There are many groups in Canada and America right now. Probably the danger that is faced is more so from terrorist groups who do not have anything to do with Islam. Mm-hmm. They might be sometimes white supremacist groups, or some other groups who are working for some agenda. And in history and around the world, we have known of terrorists in many different contexts. Sometimes what starts out as a terrorist group becomes actually the leader of a nation, and then that nation becomes a world-respected nation, touted as one of the democracies in its environment, and so on. So things change, and one person's freedom fighter may be another person's terrorist. But for our purposes here, and it's very important for us as Muslims, we need to clarify for our Muslim youth the difference between those interpretations of Quran and the prophetic sayings that lead to violence, which are mistaken interpretations, and those interpretations which lead to peace and serenity and harmony among all peoples, which is really the correct interpretation, and that is what Islam really is all about.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shabir, what would you say to a young person who is a little bit confused and is thinking, I want to go out and fight in the way of God? I have this zeal, not enough people are doing it. How would you respond to that, Dr. Shabir?
Well, first we would say that God is in control of all affairs. And why would you want to fight in the way of God? You want to align yourself with God's program. And what's God's program? God's program is to leave people free. They have the choice to believe and do right, or disbelieve and or do wrong. So God has given them that freedom. It's not for us as individuals to go policing them. Even the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was being told, "Lasta alayhim bimusaytir." You are not one to supervise over people. So what is the Prophet to do? وَذَكِّرْ إِنَّ فَعَتِ الذِّكْرَ. You are to give the message, because the message is going to be beneficial for people. It is only when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, functioned as a state leader that he had the responsibility to govern. And part of governance means ensuring the safety of your citizens, even to the point of having an army, which in Canada would be called a peacekeeping force. But that's an army that is ready and trained to use violence if necessary and when necessary, but in a justified manner. So in a similar way, the Muslim polity will have a trained army to defend the nation state, to defend the frontiers, and to use violence, if necessary, in a justified manner, to protect the rights of the citizens within the Muslim polity, but even to go beyond that, to protect the rights of downtrodden and oppressed people, wherever they happen to be, unless there is a diplomatic solution that could be had, in which case war would be a last resort. But never can it be that individuals would be sanctioned to go out on their own and take up arms and go fighting. This would be chaotic. This would be what the Quran terms as fasad. So a young man who thinks, I'm going to go serve the Islamic cause by fighting against non-Muslims on his own, he is contributing to fasad, which is the very opposite of Islam. This is chaos, which is condemned in the Quran.
So what about if this young person then says, look, there are all these verses in the Quran that are saying, wajahadu fi sabilillah, like fight in the, or go to engage in jihad for the sake of God, right? How do you deal with that? Nobody's doing anything about these verses. Nobody's acting on these verses.
So we have to understand all of the verses of the Quran within its context within the Quran as a whole, but also the historical social context in which the Quran was first revealed. The Quran was not written as a general document to be applied in the same way at all times and all places. Yes, the Quran is valid for all times and all places as the revelation from God for us. We're not going to have another one. But how to apply it, this is the question. And to know how to apply it, we have to see its first application. How was it first applied? What was the circumstances? What were the circumstances on the ground that gave rise to the Quran speaking as the way it is? So a verse like the one you cited, "Wajahidu fi sabilillah," this is in the plural. It means struggle in the way of God. This was addressed to the first Muslim community, but that first Muslim community was under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he was giving them the call and directing them where to go, when to go, who to fight against, and when to fight, and in what way. So it was not for individuals to take this in their own hands. Like an individual, under the guidance of the Prophet, peace be upon him, could not go off on his own and go attack some non-Muslims. This would have been chaotic. And in fact, it did happen on one occasion that a Muslim got into a skirmish with somebody else. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, is reported to have said to him, "You're a warmonger," condemning his action. So Muslims, if it so happens that they're in an organized polity in which they have a recognized leader, and they're following the dictates of that leader, who himself will work in consultation with the people of his state, then that leader, if that leader calls for a war, it will be the army, the trained army, who will go out and fight. We don't want to send untrained people who will be a danger to themselves and others. If you see how a trained army unit operates, whether you're seeing this in a movie, but that's the closest we get to seeing it, right? Unless there's a journalist who is implanted in the midst of a war, showing us how an army operates. So the army personnel, they operate as units. And the units are trained to protect each other, but also to protect civilians and to make sure. I mean, they're trained. They go through training. If a civilian pops up, you shoot the civilian. If you shoot the civilian, you're failing in your training. So but our people as well, if they go out into a justified battle, they have to go out with proper training to ensure civilian immunity. And they have to make sure that they're using proportional means. They're not just wantonly killing people, but they are doing what is necessary for the achievement of a noble objective. And the noble objective is not such simply, okay, we want to make sure that there is an Islamic state. That is a noble objective, but it is not one for which we're going to go to war. If you want an Islamic state, you need to persuade people that Islam is the truth. When people embrace Islam, they're going to form themselves into an Islamic state so naturally. And that's how it has to be. It's not by imposition, but by persuasion.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.